There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the cloak of a Tuesday evening, or the simple act of tying a shoe, or in this case, the quiet, pre-party ritual of adjusting a friend's tie. You don't recognize them as hinges upon which your entire world is about to swing. They have no thunder, no lightning, just the soft click of a lock you never knew was there, finally turning. For me, that moment smelled of the sandalwood cologne Julian always wore and was lit by the single, warm lamp in our hallway, a little golden island in the deepening blue of the evening. He stood before the hall mirror, wrestling with a dark silk tie, his brow furrowed in a way that was usually reserved for untangling a stubborn line of code. He was all sharp angles and frustratingly handsome geometry in his charcoal suit, a man built for boardrooms and success, momentarily defeated by a strip of fabric. I had been watching him from the doorway of my room, leaning against the frame, nursing a glass of water and the familiar, low-grade ache that came with seeing him like this. It was a quiet, private kind of pain, one I had cultivated for years, tending to it like a secret, fragile plant in a dark room. Loving Julian was like living with a constant, low-frequency hum in the background of my life. Most of the time I could ignore it, tune it out, but in moments of quiet like this, it was the only sound I could hear. He sighed, a gust of pure frustration, and dropped his hands. He caught my reflection in the mirror, and a small, tired smile touched his lips. It didn't quite reach his eyes. His eyes hadn't been reached by much of anything for the past 3 months. Struggling, I asked, my voice softer than I intended. "This stupid thing has a mind of its own," he muttered, turning to face me. He held the ends of the tie out as if in surrender. "You were always better at this stuff." The details, it was true. I was a photographer. My life was a study in details, in light and shadow, in the minute compositions that tell a larger story. Julian was the big picture, the sweeping algorithm, the forward momentum. I was the quiet observer cataloging the journey. I pushed myself off the doorframe and walked toward him, setting my glass on the small hall table. The space between us shrank, and the air grew thick, charged with all the things we never said. It was always like this when we were close, a sudden shift in atmospheric pressure that only I seemed to feel. I took the 2 ends of the silk tie from his hands, my fingers brushing against his. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to the cool, smooth fabric. I began the familiar motions, a muscle memory from helping my father with his own ties for countless formal events. Left over right, up and through the loop, down and across the front. My movements were practiced, efficient. I was focused on the task, on the geometry of the knot, on anything but the proximity of him. I could feel the heat radiating from his chest through the crisp cotton of his shirt. I could see the faint stubble along his jaw, the tiny, tired lines around his eyes. He was so close I could count the flecks of gold in his brown irises. The hum in my chest intensified, vibrating up into my throat. I just needed to finish the knot, to pat his chest in that way friends do, and retreat back to the safety of distance. I tightened the knot, preparing to slide it up to his collar. But his hand came up and rested gently on top of mine, stilling my movements. His touch was light, but it felt like an anchor, rooting me to the spot. I froze, my gaze locked on the half-finished knot. I could feel my own pulse hammering in my fingertips, pressed against his chest. "Leo," he said, his voice a low murmur, barely disturbing the quiet air. I finally lifted my eyes to his. His expression was unreadable, a deep and turbulent thing I couldn't capture or define. "Could you do it again?" he asked. And then he added the words that changed everything. But slower. "Just keep your hands there for a minute." And in that quiet hallway, with the city humming beyond our window and a party waiting for us somewhere across town, the world stopped. The ordinary moment revealed itself for what it was, a door, and he was asking me to walk through it. My heart, my foolish, hopeful, terrified heart, didn't know whether to run or to stay and see what was on the other side. It only knew that his hand was still on mine, a gentle, questioning pressure, and for the first time in a very long time, the low, constant hum of my love for him sounded less like an ache and more like a song. to understand why my hands trembled as I slowly undid that knot. You have to understand the architecture of our friendship. It was a structure built over a decade, with a foundation laid in the acidic, stop-bath-scented air of a university darkroom. I was a freshman photography major, all quiet intensity and black and white film, convinced I was the next Ansel Adams. Julian was a sophomore computer science student, a force of nature with a booming laugh and an easy confidence that seemed both impossibly magnetic and utterly foreign to my own nature. He had signed up for my intro to photography class thinking it would be an easy a simple credit to offset his brutally logical coursework. He expected to point a camera and click. He didn't expect the meticulous, patient chemistry of it all. I remember the first time I really saw him. Not just as the loud guy in the back of the lecture hall who asked too many questions, but as a subject. Our first major assignment was portraiture, and we were supposed to partner up. By some cruel twist of fate or dumb luck, we were the last two people in the room without a partner. He'd clapped me on the back with a grin that could power a small city and said, "Looks like it's you and me, camera guy." I remember thinking that his energy was too much for a photograph, that it would simply blow out the highlights and leave no room for subtlety. I was wrong. The first time I had him in front of my lens, in the soft, diffused light of a late afternoon studio, all of that kinetic energy fell away. What was left was something else entirely. A stillness, a quiet, contemplative depth in his eyes that I suspected very few people ever got to see. He was a terrible student, impatient with exposure times, clumsy with the developing tongs, but he was an extraordinary subject. He was unself-conscious, open, and the camera loved him. More dangerously, so did I. Our friendship cemented itself over trays of developer and long nights spent in the campus library, him debugging code while I edited photos, two different languages seeking a similar kind of perfection. We were an odd pairing. He was the sun, I was the shadow that gave it definition. He pulled me into his orbit of friends, taught me how to navigate social gatherings without feeling like an alien anthropologist. I, in turn, offered him a quiet space, a harbor from the constant pressure he put on himself to succeed, to perform, to be the person everyone expected him to be. Our first apartment after college was a logical extension of this symbiosis. It was a cramped two-bedroom with questionable plumbing and a view of a brick wall, but it was ours. It became a living museum of our shared lives. My framed photographs hung on the walls, many of them portraits of him from our college days. His complex diagrams for some new software architecture were often spread across the dining table we rarely ate at. We built a life in the spaces between my quiet observation and his relentless motion. My feelings for him were a secret I kept locked in the most secure vault of my heart. They were a part of me, woven into the very fabric of my being, but they were for my eyes only. I watched him date, fall in and out of love, get his heart broken, and break a few hearts himself. I was his confidant, his steady presence, the one he came to for advice or just to sit in comfortable silence with a beer after a long week. Each time he brought a new girlfriend home, I would feel a familiar, dull pang, a quiet resignation. I would be polite, I would be friendly, and I would retreat a little further into myself, reinforcing the walls around my secret. It was a painful, but sustainable, existence. The friendship was too precious to risk. Julian was the central pillar of my life, and the thought of losing him over feelings he likely didn't share was a cataclysm I couldn't bear to contemplate. So I learned to live with the hum. I learned to appreciate the platonic intimacy we had, the easy way we shared a couch, the casual touches, the shorthand of a long and storied friendship. It was enough. It had to be. For the last 4 years of this arrangement, there was Sarah. She was smart and kind, and she genuinely loved him. I thought, for a long time, that this was it. This was the end of the line for my foolish, lingering hope. He was going to marry her, and I would be the best man at their wedding, smiling for the photographer and delivering a heartfelt speech while my own heart quietly disintegrated. I had prepared myself for that eventuality. I had practiced the smile in the mirror. I had even started to believe that I wanted it for him. This simple, conventional happiness. Sarah understood our friendship for the most part. She called me Julian's anchor, and I suppose she was right. I kept him grounded. But she never understood the depth of the harbor I provided, the quiet refuge that existed solely for him, a place even she couldn't fully access. It wasn't a competition, it was just a different kind of connection, one forged in a different element. Theirs was built in the bright, open air. Ours was formed in the quiet darkroom, a place of patience and gradual revelation. And then, 3 months before that evening in the hallway, the structure of Julian's life collapsed. He came home one Tuesday night, long after I'd gone to bed. I was woken not by a loud noise, but by a sudden, oppressive silence where noise should have been. Usually, when he came in late, I'd hear the familiar sounds, the clink of his keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, the soft thud of his briefcase on the floor, the sigh as he kicked off his shoes. But there was nothing, just a heavy, weighted silence that felt wrong. I got out of bed and padded into the living room. He was just standing there, in the middle of the room, his back to me. He was still in his work suit, but his shoulders were slumped, his whole posture a study in defeat. "Jules?" I asked, my voice thick with sleep. He didn't turn around. "She's gone," he said, and his voice was a hollowed-out thing, an echo in an empty chamber. "She ended it. Packed her stuff from my place while I was at work." I didn't know what to say. The part of me that had harbored a secret, selfish hope for a decade felt a flicker of something ugly and triumphant, and I hated myself for it instantly. But the much larger part, the part that was his friend, just ached for him. I walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. He flinched, just slightly, then leaned into the touch, his body trembling. He finally turned, and his face was wrecked. It was a complete and utter devastation I had never seen on him before. Not when he failed an exam, not when a project at work imploded, not even when his grandmother died. This was different. This was a foundational crack. "It's just over," he whispered, as if he couldn't make the words solid. "For years. Just gone." He didn't cry, not then. He just stood there, looking lost in our living room, a ghost in his own life. I did the only thing I could think to do. I guided him to the couch and sat him down. I made him a cup of tea he didn't drink and put a blanket over his shoulders he didn't seem to feel. We sat there in silence for what felt like hours, the city lights painting shifting patterns on the wall. At some point, his exhaustion overtook his shock, and his head slumped sideways, landing on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. It was a simple, unconscious gesture of need, but for me, it was a cataclysm. It was a line being crossed, a boundary dissolving. He had never done this before. We were close, but there was always a careful, unspoken buffer of space between us. Now, there was none. I could feel the rhythm of his breathing, the weight of his head, the warmth of him seeping through my t-shirt. I sat there, paralyzed, for the rest of the night, long after my arm went numb, my heart a frantic, caged bird in my chest. I was his anchor, and the storm had finally come. That night was the beginning of the shift. The breakup with Sarah had fundamentally altered the landscape of our lives, and in the aftershock, Julian began to drift. He was untethered, and without thinking, he had tethered himself to me. The incident on the couch was not an isolated event. It was the first tremor of an earthquake that would slowly, methodically, dismantle the careful architecture of our friendship. The change was subtle at first, a series of small alterations to our long-established routines. He started working from home more often, his presence in the apartment a constant, humming energy that both thrilled and terrified me. Our apartment, once a place of easy, parallel lives, became a shared bubble, a small world with a population of 2. The most significant change, however, was in his sudden, desperate need for proximity. Julian, who had always been so self-sufficient, so contained in his own skin, now seemed to crave physical contact in a way that left me breathless and perpetually on edge. It began with our evenings. He couldn't stand to be alone in his room. He would emerge, looking lost and hollow-eyed, and gravitate to wherever I was. If I was reading in the living room, he would sit on the couch, not next to me, but close enough that our arms would brush if I shifted. If I was developing film in the small darkroom I'd converted from a closet, he'd pull up a stool and just sit in the dim, red light. Watching me work in silence, the quiet splash of chemicals the only sound between us. This new neediness coalesced into a ritual. It became our movie nights. It started innocently enough. A week after the breakup, he'd suggested we watch an old action movie, something loud and mindless to fill the oppressive silence of the apartment. We sat on opposite ends of our worn, comfortable couch, the way we always had. But halfway through the film, in the middle of a chaotic car chase, he had quietly, almost imperceptibly, shifted closer. Then, a few minutes later, closer still. By the end of the movie, his leg was pressed against mine, from hip to knee. A line of heat that I felt through 2 layers of denim. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I was so hyper-aware of that point of contact that I couldn't tell you what happened in the film. It was as if my entire consciousness had narrowed to that single, warm line. The next night, he suggested another movie. This time, he sat down right next to me from the start. He draped the large, woolen blanket we kept on the couch over both of our laps. Under the cover of the blanket, his hand, which was resting on the cushion between us, found its way next to mine. His fingers brushed against my own. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the moment he realizes. He'll pull away, apologize, and the spell will be broken. But he didn't. His fingers just rested there, a breath away from mine. The movie played on, a meaningless flicker of light and sound in the background of the roaring inferno in my own head. My internal monologue was a frantic, desperate negotiation. Was this intentional? Was it a subconscious gesture, a simple seeking of comfort from the nearest warm body? Or was it something more? Interpreting Julian's actions had become my full-time, torturous occupation. I was a detective searching for clues in a case where I was terrified of finding the answer. This ritual became our new normal. 3, 4, sometimes 5 nights a week, we would end up on the couch, under the blanket, a silent study in escalating proximity. The space between us dwindled until it was non-existent. He would lean his head on my shoulder, just as he had that first night. But now it was a regular occurrence, an expected part of the evening. He would sigh, a sound of deep, bone-weary contentment, and I would feel the vibration of it travel through my entire body. I learned the smell of his shampoo, the exact weight of his head, the way his breathing would deepen as he started to drift off to sleep. I became an unwilling expert in the topography of Julian. It was exquisite torture. My body was alight with a want so profound it felt like a physical illness, while my mind screamed at me to remain perfectly still, to not give myself away, to not shatter this fragile, ambiguous new intimacy. He needed comfort. He was my friend. This was just what friends did. I repeated these phrases to myself like a mantra, a desperate attempt to keep my own heart from staging a full-scale rebellion. The plausible deniability of it all was the most maddening part. He was grieving. He was lonely. He was leaning on his best friend. Any single action could be explained away, but the sum of them? The consistent, nightly pattern of seeking me out, of closing every inch of space between us? It felt like a question he was asking without words. A question I was too afraid to answer. The boundary of the couch was breached one night about a month into this new regime. He'd woken up from a nightmare, shouting Sarah's name. I rushed into his room to find him sitting bolt upright, drenched in sweat, his eyes wide with a frantic, haunted look. I sat on the edge of his bed, talked him down, my voice low and steady until his breathing evened out. "Don't go," he'd whispered, his voice raw. "Please, just for a bit." So I stayed. I lay down on top of the covers, on the far side of his queen-sized bed, a rigid, unmoving plank of a man. The space between us felt like a vast, cold ocean. But as the minutes ticked by, I felt him shift, a slow migration across the mattress until his back was pressed against mine. The warmth was immediate, startling. We lay like that for hours, back to back, 2 continents pressed together, not speaking. I didn't sleep a single second. I was too busy cataloging the sensation of his shoulder blades against mine, the shared heat, the subtle movements as he breathed. It was the most chaste, and yet the most profoundly intimate, experience of my life. This, too, became part of the ritual. Not every night, but often enough. A nightmare, a bad day at work, a wave of loneliness. Any excuse would do. The pretense was paper thin, and yet we both clung to it. It was safer that way. It allowed him to seek the comfort he needed without having to name it. And it allowed me to have him close without having to confront the terrifying hope that was beginning to bloom in the ruins of my carefully constructed defenses. I was living in a state of suspended disbelief, a waking dream from which I was terrified to wake. Each night was a gift and a curse, filling me with a desperate, yearning warmth that would inevitably curdle into a cold, anxious dread by morning. I was so focused on interpreting his signals, on managing my own reactions, that I didn't stop to think about what was happening inside of him. I saw him as the unknowing initiator, the one acting on instinct. I never considered that he might be just as lost in this new territory as I was, just as terrified of the map he was drawing between us. And so we continued, orbiting each other in the small universe of our apartment, our silence charged with unspoken gravity. The couch, the blanket, the shared bed, they became the sacred spaces of our new, undefined relationship. It was a fragile ecosystem, a delicate balance of need and fear. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it couldn't last. Something had to break. Some word had to be spoken. The pressure was building, and the quiet, ordinary container of our friendship was beginning to crack. Which brings me back to the hallway, to the silk tie in my hands, and to the weight of his gaze as he asked me to keep my hands there, to do it all again, but slower. The ritual had moved beyond the safe confines of the couch, and we were standing at a precipice, the unspoken thing finally threatening to find its voice. My breath hitched. Slower. He wanted me to go slower. He wanted my hands to stay on his chest. It was the first time the request had been verbalized, a direct, unambiguous instruction that stripped away all layers of plausible deniability. This wasn't an unconscious seeking of comfort in the dark. This was happening here, now, in the light of the hallway, with both of us wide awake and looking directly at each other. The hum in my chest crescendoed into a roar. The silence stretched, thin and taut, and in his eyes, I saw a flicker of the same fear and uncertainty that was ricocheting around my own heart. He was on the edge of the cliff with me, and he was just as terrified of the fall. My fingers, which had been frozen in place, began to move with a painstaking slowness. I loosened the knot I had just made, my knuckles brushing against the warm column of his throat. He swallowed, and I felt the movement under my skin. I unwound the silk, letting it fall limp in my hands once more. The entire universe had contracted to this small space, to the task of retying a knot that no longer mattered. The party we were supposed to attend was a distant, irrelevant fiction. The only real thing was the feel of the silk in my hands, the heat of his body, and the unspoken question hanging in the air between us, heavy and ripe. I started again, my movements deliberate, almost meditative. Left over right. My thumb grazed the sensitive skin just below his jaw, up and through the loop. My fingers brushed against his collarbone. He hadn't moved. He hadn't breathed. He was watching my hands as if they were performing some sacred, intricate rite. I was watching his face, searching for a sign, a map for this uncharted territory. His eyes were dark, his lips slightly parted. The restless energy that usually defined him was gone, replaced by a profound, vulnerable stillness. It was the same stillness I had seen through my camera lens all those years ago, the hidden part of him that he had, perhaps unknowingly, always shown only to me. I brought the wide end of the tie down and across the front, my hand resting flat against the solid wall of his chest. I could feel his heartbeat, a steady, powerful rhythm beneath my palm. It was beating as fast as my own. That single, shared biological fact gave me a sliver of courage. I wasn't alone in this. I looked up from his chest and met his eyes. The question was there, clear and terrifying. It wasn't about the tie anymore. It never was. Leo, he breathed out, his voice barely a whisper. His hand, which had been hanging at his side, came up and gently cupped the back of my neck, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin just behind my ear. The touch sent a shower of sparks down my spine. It wasn't the tentative, questioning touch from before. It was a confirmation, a statement. My carefully constructed walls, the ones I had spent a decade building and reinforcing, crumbled into dust. All the years of silent pining, of quiet observation, of resigned acceptance, it all fell away, leaving me utterly exposed. He leaned in, his forehead coming to rest against mine. We stood there for a long moment, breathing the same air, our heartbeats a frantic, synchronized drumbeat. "Is this okay?" he whispered, his breath warm against my lips. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the key to the lock. He was giving me the choice. He was laying his own vulnerability bare and asking for my consent, not just for what was about to happen, but for everything that had led us to this moment. He was acknowledging the shift, the ritual, the unspoken thing between us. He was finally giving it a name. And I, the quiet observer who had spent a lifetime documenting life from a safe distance, had to make a choice. I could retreat, re-establish the boundaries, and pretend this never happened, preserving the friendship at the cost of my own heart. Or I could step forward, into the terrifying, beautiful unknown. Yes, I breathed, the word a puff of air, a release of a decade of held breath. Yes, Julian. It's okay. And then he closed the final, infinitesimal distance between us. His lips met mine, and it was not a kiss of passion or demand, but one of profound, hesitant discovery. It was soft and careful, and it tasted of sandalwood and terrified relief. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was the sound of a door clicking shut behind us, locking us into a new room, a new world that we would have to navigate together. My hands, which were still resting on his chest, finally moved. One slid up to cup his jaw, my thumb stroking his cheek, while the other tangled in the silk of the forgotten tie. In that kiss, the long, lonely hum in my soul finally resolved into a chord, a quiet, perfect harmony that I knew, with absolute certainty, I never wanted to live without again. The aftermath was quieter than the storm that preceded it. The kiss didn't end with a passionate sweep into the bedroom. It ended with a slow, mutual drawing back, our foreheads still touching. We stood in the hallway for what felt like an eternity, simply breathing, recalibrating to the new gravity of the world. The party was forgotten, a ghost of an obligation that had evaporated in the heat of the moment. Julian's hand was still at the back of my neck, his thumb making slow, soothing circles, while my hand was still on his chest, feeling the frantic, wonderful beat of his heart. The silence wasn't awkward or tense. It was a new kind of silence for us. It was full, not empty. It was a space for feeling, not for the frantic internal analysis that had consumed me for months. Eventually, he spoke, his voice still a low whisper. "We're not going to that party, are we?" A small, shaky laugh escaped me. "No, I don't think we are," he nodded, a slow movement against my forehead. "Good." We untangled ourselves with a shared reluctance, as if breaking contact would break the spell. We ended up in the living room, on the couch, that fraught and sacred territory, but the dynamic was entirely different. We sat close, his thigh pressed against mine, but the agonizing ambiguity was gone. In its place was a fragile, tender certainty. We didn't talk about what had happened, not right away. We just sat, and I watched as a procession of emotions moved across his face. Confusion, relief, a flicker of fear, and then something that looked like peace. It was the fear that worried me. I had gotten my moment, the one I had only allowed myself to dream of in my most private fantasies, but the dawn was coming, and I had no idea what it would bring. The next morning, the fear proved to be well-founded. I woke up alone in my bed. For a dizzying moment, I thought I had dreamt it all. The tie, the whispered request, the kiss. But the faint scent of his sandalwood cologne on my pillow was proof that it had been real. He had come into my room after I'd fallen asleep and left his scent behind. Or perhaps he had slept there. The indentation on the other side of the bed suggested a presence. I got up and walked into the living room. The apartment was silent and still. A note was on the kitchen counter, written in his familiar, sharp script. "Leo, I'm sorry. I needed to go for a run. To think. We'll talk later." My heart sank. To think. Those were two of the most terrifying words in the English language. Thinking was what people did before they backtracked, before they decided they'd made a mistake. The beautiful, fragile certainty of the night before shattered, replaced by a cold, familiar dread. I had misinterpreted everything. He had been vulnerable, grieving, and I had let him cross a line. Or worse, I had crossed it with him. He was just looking for comfort, and in my selfishness, I had allowed it to become something more, something he was now regretting in the harsh light of day. The old narrative, the one where I was the foolish one pining for his straight best friend, came rushing back with a vengeance. He didn't come home for hours. When he finally walked through the door in his running gear, flushed and avoiding my eyes, the space between us was a chasm wider than it had ever been. The easy intimacy of the past 3 months had vanished, replaced by a tense, brittle silence. He mumbled something about needing a shower and disappeared into his room, closing the door behind him. The click of the latch was like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. For 3 months, his door had been left ajar, an unspoken invitation. Now it was closed. The boundary was back, thicker and higher than ever before. This went on for 2 days. 2 days of agonizing silence, of polite, monosyllabic exchanges about groceries and mail. We were roommates again, strangers sharing a space. He was distant, withdrawn, a ghost haunting the edges of my vision. He spent hours on the phone in his room, the door firmly shut, his voice a low, indecipherable murmur. I assumed he was talking to friends, trying to make sense of what he'd done, trying to figure out how to let me down easy. Each muffled sound from behind that door was another turn of the knife in my gut. The hope that had bloomed so brightly was wilting, dying from the sudden, brutal frost of his withdrawal. On the 3rd day, I couldn't take it anymore. The quiet observer in me had to die. I couldn't just watch this happen, couldn't just let him erase the most honest moment of my life without a fight. My pain was turning into a quiet, simmering anger. I deserved more than this. Our friendship, whatever it was now, deserved more than a silent, cowardly retreat. I waited for him to come out of his room for dinner. He was grabbing a carton of takeout from the fridge, his back to me, still trying to pretend I didn't exist in any meaningful way. "Julian," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. He stiffened but didn't turn around. "Yeah." "Turn around and look at me." He hesitated for a long moment, then slowly turned, his expression guarded, his jaw tight. He looked exhausted. "We need to talk about this," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "You don't get to do what you did and then just disappear. You don't get to kiss me like that and then pretend I'm just the guy who pays half the rent. I won't let you." A flash of something, guilt, frustration, crossed his face. "Leo, I don't know what to say. Try saying the truth." I shot back, the words sharper than I intended. "Tell me it was a mistake. Tell me you were confused and lonely and you used me to feel something. Tell me you regret it. Just say something, because this silence is unbearable. It's disrespectful. To me, and to whatever we've been to each other for the last 10 years. He winced as if I'd physically struck him. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure distress. "It wasn't a mistake," he said, his voice cracking. "That's the problem. It didn't feel like a mistake. It felt right. And that scares the hell out of me." The confession hung in the air between us, raw and unexpected. My anger deflated instantly, replaced by the familiar ache. But this time it was tinged with a sliver of understanding. "Why does it scare you?" I asked, my voice softening. He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, frantic confusion. "Because my entire life, I've had a plan, a blueprint. College, job, meet a girl, get married. Sarah was part of that plan. It all made sense. And then it all fell apart. And in the middle of the wreckage, there was you. You've always been there, my anchor. And I started leaning on you. And it was the only thing that felt solid. But then it changed. I started needing to be near you in a way I couldn't explain. I'd lie in bed at night, knowing you were just down the hall, and the only thing that would calm me down was the thought of coming to your room." He took a step closer, his hands gesturing, trying to pull the right words out of the air. "That night, in the hallway, I wasn't thinking. I was just feeling. For the first time in months, I wasn't grieving what I'd lost. I was just feeling this incredible warmth, this rightness, just from you being close to me. And when I kissed you, It was like everything clicked into place. It was the calmest I've felt since she left. Then what's the problem? I whispered, my throat tight. The problem is the morning after, he burst out, his voice rising with frustration. The problem is that I woke up and the blueprint was gone. My whole life, I've been me. Julian, the guy who dates women. And suddenly, I'm not? Or maybe I am, but I'm also something else. I don't know what this makes me, Leo. I don't know what I'm doing. All I know is that I kissed my best friend, and it's the only thing that's made sense in months, and it makes no sense at all. And I'm terrified that I'm going to drag you into my mess and hurt you. I can't lose you. You're the most important person in my life. The idea of losing our friendship over my own confusion, it's not a risk I can take, and there it was. His fear wasn't about me, or about his feelings for me. It was about his own identity, about the story he had always told himself about who he was. And beneath that, it was about protecting me, about protecting our bond. He wasn't withdrawing because he regretted the kiss. He was withdrawing because he valued our friendship so much that he would rather live in silent misery than risk destroying it with his own uncertainty. He had closed the door to his room not to shut me out, but to cage his own confusion, to stop it from spilling out and wrecking the most stable thing he had left. My quiet observer had been wrong again. I had been so busy cataloging my own emotional landscape that I had failed to see the tectonic shifts happening in his. I closed the distance between us, stopping just a foot away from him. He looked down, unable to meet my gaze. I reached out and gently tilted his chin up, forcing him to look at me. Julian, I said, my voice steady and clear. Look at me. You think you're protecting our friendship? This isn't protecting it. This is killing it. Our friendship has always been about honesty, about being the one person the other can be completely real with. You hiding in your room, us talking like strangers, that's what will ruin us. Not a kiss. I took a deep breath, gathering all the courage I had left. You want to know what I think? I think you're so worried about what this makes you, about finding the right label for it, that you're missing the point. It doesn't have to have a name right now. It doesn't have to fit into your old blueprint. Maybe we just start a new one. Together. All I know, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper, is that for 10 years, I have loved you. Quietly. Patiently. And I was prepared to do it for the rest of my life without you ever knowing. Because I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. But you kissed me. You opened the door. And I'm not going to let you close it again out of fear. Your confusion doesn't scare me. Your silence does. Tears welled in his eyes, and a single one tracked its way down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just stared at me, a look of raw, dawning comprehension on his face. He had been trying to solve an emotional problem with logic, trying to debug his own heart, and it had only created more errors. My confession, my decade of silent love, wasn't a pressure point. It was a release valve. It told him he wasn't alone in this, that this wasn't some fleeting, confusing impulse, but something with history, with roots. You love me? He asked, the words full of wonder, as if he was hearing a foreign language he suddenly understood perfectly. More than I know how to say, I admitted, my own voice thick with emotion. So please, stop thinking. Stop trying to figure it all out. Just be here, with me. We can be confused together. A choked, wet sound that was half laugh, half sob escaped his lips. And then he surged forward, closing the final gap between us, and wrapped his arms around me, holding me so tightly it felt like he was trying to merge our two bodies into one. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, and I felt his tears on my skin. I held him just as tightly, my own eyes burning. The tension of the last 3 days, the last 3 months, the last 10 years, finally broke, washing away in a flood of shared, vulnerable relief. We weren't just fixing a tie. We were unraveling a decade of unspoken truths. And in the wreckage of his old life, and in the quiet corners of mine, we had found each other. Not as an anchor and a ship in a storm, but as two people choosing to build a new harbor, together, in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create. In the days that followed our confrontation, the atmosphere in the apartment transformed. The brittle tension was replaced by a soft, tentative tenderness. It was like the world after a storm, the air clean and quiet, the ground damp and ready for new growth. We didn't have another big, defining conversation. There was no need. The real work had been done in that moment of raw honesty in the kitchen. We had laid our fears and our feelings bare, and in doing so, had created a new foundation to build upon. We started not with grand romantic gestures, but with the rebuilding of our small, shared rituals, now imbued with a new, explicit meaning. The first morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I walked into the kitchen to find Julian standing by the counter, 2 mugs already filled. He looked up when I entered, and a slow, shy smile spread across his face. It was the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in days, and it reached all the way to his eyes. He didn't say anything, just pushed one of the mugs toward me. I took it, our fingers brushing. The simple, domestic act felt more significant than 1,000 spoken words. It was a promise of a new morning, a new normal. We drank our coffee in a comfortable silence, the kind we used to have, but it was different now. It wasn't the silence of 2 friends coexisting in parallel. It was the shared silence of 2 people on the same path, looking in the same direction. That night, the ritual of the movie returned, but the pretense was gone. As we settled onto the couch, he didn't just drape the blanket over us. He opened his arm in a clear invitation. I leaned into his side without hesitation, resting my head on his shoulder. It was the same position I had held so many times before, rigid with anxiety and unspoken want. Now, it was just comfortable. It was home. He wrapped his arm around me, pulling me closer, and rested his cheek on the top of my head. There was no internal debate, no frantic analysis of his motives. There was just the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his body, and the quiet contentment of being exactly where I was supposed to be. Halfway through the movie, I felt his fingers gently tracing patterns on my arm, a deliberate, mindful touch that sent shivers of pure happiness through me. He was no longer the unknowing initiator. He was a conscious, willing participant. The closed door to his bedroom remained a symbol, but its meaning had been inverted. A few nights later, as we were getting ready for bed, he stopped me in the hallway, in the very spot where everything had changed. He took my hand, his grip warm and sure. "My room tonight?" he asked, his voice soft, his eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. It wasn't a request born of a nightmare or loneliness. It was a simple, honest want. "Okay," I said, my heart doing a little flip. We walked into his room together. He didn't just leave the door ajar. He reached back and quietly, deliberately, clicked it shut. The sound was no longer one of exclusion or fear. It was a sound of privacy, of intention. It was the 2 of us, choosing to be in this space together, shutting out the rest of the world. Lying in his bed, face to face, was a revelation. There was no vast, cold ocean between us anymore. He reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering on my cheek. "I'm still scared," he admitted in a whisper. "I still feel like I don't have a map for this. But when I'm with you, I don't feel like I need one. Is that crazy?" "No," I whispered back, covering his hand with my own. "It's not crazy. It just means you're navigating by a different kind of compass now," he smiled, a real, deep smile of relief. "My compass," he murmured, and he leaned in and kissed me again. This kiss was different from the first. It was less about discovery and more about confirmation. It was slow and deep and sure. It was a kiss that said, "This is real. We are real." We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together. We didn't need to label it for anyone else, didn't need to explain the slow, seismic shift that had occurred within the 4 walls of our apartment. Our love story wasn't written in grand pronouncements, but in 1,000 tiny, quiet moments. It was in the way he'd now bring me a cup of tea in the darkroom without being asked. It was in the way my hand would instinctively find his when we walked down the street. It was in the photos I started taking of him again, not as a subject, but as my partner, the quiet joy in his eyes a reflection of my own. The hum in my soul had finally found its home, not as a source of pain, but as the steady, resonant frequency of a shared life. We had found our way not by following a pre-drawn map, but by learning to trust the quiet, magnetic pull that had always existed between us, a force as natural and as undeniable as gravity itself.